So very good to see so many of you here, and my name is Amalayodhin, and we will be continuing on the series, the fourth of these talks on the three lakshanas, and that'll be it for this particular series. So we are going to look at the lakshana of anatta this evening, which basically means something like no self. Actually, the title of the talk is Emptiness, which is slightly sort of mistitled. It should actually be something like No Self or Anatta. But the last time I got annoyed and complained about the title of a talk, it turned out I had written it. So I'm not going to make the same mistake. I probably did it as well this time. So anyway. But the reason is that it should be more no self or anatta is because these lakshanas are actually go all the way back to the teaching of the Buddha. And so the first week we looked at dukkha, or unsatisfactoriness, or suffering, really better sort of translated as unsatisfactoriness. These three marks, by the way, just to say, they're the sort of marks of samsaric existence. So our unenlightened experience is samsara. It's conditioned, it's marked by greed, hatred and delusion, and these three lakshanas are three sort of characteristics of that particular experience, that particular unenlightened experience. And the first one that we looked at was dukkha, or unsatisfactoriness, and then last week I think with Kusalasara we looked at impermanence, or anicca, and this week we'll finish off the series with anatta, or no self. The reason I say is it's slightly mistitled actually is because emptiness is a further elaboration of the teaching on no self, but it comes a bit later in Buddhism. It takes the teaching of no self and just expands it and unfolds it a bit more. But strictly, if you're looking at the lakshanas, this particular lakshana is the lakshana of no self, or sort of lack of essence, something like that. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But as I was saying, if those of you that were here during the week on unsatisfactoriness, dukkha, it's very, very easy to pick these up badly. To pick up the wisdom teachings badly. So these are wisdom teachings in Buddhism. They help us to see through to reality or enlightenment, and they're very, very easy to pick up wrong. The ideals are very, very easy to pick up wrong, aren't they? It's amazing how badly ideals can go. I've been rewatching. Is it Mad Cud? What's the documentary Mad Country? Wild Country. Wild Country. I was like, there's not two words in it, is there? Wild Country. So it's this documentary on Netflix about what was his name? Osho, that's right. Yeah. And just how badly it all goes wrong, how dreadfully it all goes wrong. And of course, that all goes wrong from ideals picked up poorly. And as I was saying on the week in dukkha, talking about unsatisfactoriness, the Buddha likened to wisdom teachings or ideals like picking up a water snake. You have to be trained in how to do it. If you pick it up poorly, if you pick up an ideal poorly, it can sort of bite you, and it would be better had you not picked it up at all. Of course, you need ideals. A human life needs ideals, so we have not but any choice but to try and pick them up. But we need to really be confident in what we're doing when we pick them up. And anatta, or no self, or emptiness as it goes on to be, is one of these ones that's really easily picked up the wrong way. It can be really easy to misapprehend it. It's interesting, people like I run study groups for people, and they last 4 years, and quite often, even quite late into the study group, you're sort of correcting people on a misunderstanding of no self. It's very hard to sort of get what it's getting at. Even for myself, I just find it hard to get what it's getting at. But what it's definitely not saying is that there's nothing, that there's nothing to you or me. It is saying we don't have a self. I'll go into what that means a little bit more. But what that's not saying is that there's nothing there. And this teaching has been used in that particular way through history. So I was saying that the Zen monks during World War II in Japan justified war crimes committed by the Japanese army or suicide bombings by the Japanese fighter pilots on the basis of this teaching that even though they were killing living beings, those living beings had no self, so really that they weren't doing anything, they weren't causing harm because nobody was harmed. So you can see how it's sort of picked up wrong. I had a friend telling me a little while ago, he does these door knocking appeals for Karana. This is a Buddhist charity, and they live together for 6 weeks, and they go out they train together and they knock doors. And he was saying this one particular guy had just the complete wrong end of the stick on this teaching. So he'd do things like he'd eat people's porridge in the morning, and they'd go to him and say, "What happened? You ate my porridge, man. What's that about?" Like, and he's going, "Who ate whose porridge?" Because they'd have been doing a bit of study on this teaching the day before. So who ate whose porridge? So what they did was they decided to get their revenge, and they ate his porridge one morning. So he put the porridge on and they ate it all. He came storming into the living room. "Who ate all the porridge?" And of course Mike, my friend, just sits back and goes, "Who ate whose porridge?" And so he sort of gets really red. So you can pick this up very, very wrong. But I think at the start of our teaching, the Buddha talks about this as well, because the Buddha spoke very much to individuals. And all the teachings that have got passed down in Buddhism are taught to the needs of people in front of the Buddha as he was teaching. And those needs differ. So you'll often find what looks like contradictory teachings in Buddhism, because the Buddha will say one thing to one person because he thinks that will be more beneficial for them. It'll be beneficial for them to hear that, and another thing to another person. So you'll see in the Pali Canon, which is the historical record, is the record of the Buddha's teachings, oral teachings. You'll see him often say, in one particular conversation, he says, "Some say of me that I teach no self, but I say I teach self." Now, that's because what's happened in that particular instance is he's seen somebody that needs to think much more in terms of self. It's not going to be good for them to think in terms of no self. It's going to be much better for them to think in terms of self. And that, I'd say for nearly all of us, when we start along the Buddhist path, that needs to be the majority of our thinking is in terms of self. And the Buddha, most of his teachings, particularly regarding ethics, is a teaching aimed at self, isn't it? You need to be more generous. You need to be more kind. You need to be more courageous. You need to be more truthful. But that's a teaching that is directed at self. It assumes a person listening that can take on that particular teaching and through their own agency start to act on it. So initially when we get into the Buddhist path, it's really not such a good idea for us to be heavily sort of emphasizing kind of no self. We need to really think much more in terms of self. Selves that are more disciplined, that are more loving, affectionate, robust, all of those things, but much more in self. Now, of course, we can also then reflect on no self, but that has to be on the foundation of a good solid self. Initially, what we're doing is we're sort of building up a strong, healthy, happy sense of self. And from that point, you can then start to let that go into a greater understanding of no self and interconnectedness and all of that means. But initially, what that needs is a solid, healthy, happy human being. And most of our awareness needs to be put on cultivating that. And from there, will be in a very, very good place then to start thinking about no self. If you bring it in too early, it often just goes pretty wrong. And sometimes actually what Bhante Sangharakshita, the man who founded Trivana, used to say was that some people who really didn't like themselves quite really took to this teaching because they didn't like themselves, and then they quite liked the idea of not having a self. So they picked it up completely in the wrong way. Yeah? So we have to be slightly sort of careful in how we do it. But clearly there can't be nothing, because it just doesn't, Buddhism wouldn't make too much sense if there was nothing. Like, say for example, what does karma apply to? If I act unskillfully, the Buddha's teaching on karma says, well then that will have a negative consequence for me. It might not be immediate, it might be down the road. But then that has to assume that there's something there that can experience, that there's a connection between me now and me in the future, in which that karma can come to fruition and have negative consequences or positive consequences if I've behaved well. So Buddhism doesn't work if you think that there's sort of nothing. Sangharakshita thought actually that there was a group of monks not long after the Buddha died that called the Pugalavadins, and they actually cultivated this sort of teaching much more, and they died out actually. They were seen as sort of being heterodox and heretical, and they slightly died out. But Sangharakshita thought actually they had a much more accurate idea of this teaching, and their whole teaching was, look, there is a relative self, there is an empirical self, but it doesn't have any sort of fixity to it, and it's not separate from other human beings around. It's not as we experience. So the Pugalavadins would say we have a relative self, an empirical self, but we experience ourselves not as an empirical or a relative self, but as a fixed one that's separate from other people around us. So just to put it out to people here, I mean, what do you think? Because, I mean, let's just talk about how we experience the self. Like, what is it? And that is an experience, isn't it? Like, what is it that people experience? What are we talking about when we're talking about an experience of the self?
Reflection.
Say a little bit more on that.
So, when you think about yourself,
Mm.
the verb to do in that action would be reflection. So you reflect upon yourself, your character.
Oh, I see. So there's like a reflexive awareness.
Yeah, it's almost like looking in the mirror, but
Yeah.
metaphorically.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh, I see. A reflection is in like a mirror reflection. Yeah. So there's a sense of sort of being aware of yourself as a kind of entity in a particular way. Yeah. And what sort of characteristics does that entity have? Yeah.
For me personally, when I was seeking something, I felt really empty within myself. And when I actually encountered this light, I experienced just a pure state of an emptiness of attachment, like who I am, and just being a pure soul, or aware of having this pure beingness.
That's a little slightly more non-self, isn't it? So we're getting into, you've slightly loosened up your experience of self there. What's the experience of self? Yeah.
It's kind of everything all at once, right? Because you're navigating the world, and you have your physical body and sensations, but you're also really in your head.
Yeah.
And you also have your like emotional.
That's right. Yeah.
self.
Yeah.
So it's like visceral, but also quite.
Yeah. So there's this.
Cognitive.
That's right.
And it's just can feel quite like a lot.
Yeah. So there's a sort of identification of the self with the body, isn't there, and with the emotions and with the mind. Yeah. So there's this sort of sense that I am this thing, this sort of collection of sort of things that you're saying. Yeah.
So is it like ego then? Could you say?
Yeah, like ego. Yeah. That'd be the other term for it.
It's like I've never experienced it any other way. I
Mm.
only see the world through me and through everything that's out there. I've never seen it from your perspective.
Yes, yeah, that's right. So there's a sense, and that there's partly truth to that as well, isn't there? But also as well, I think what you're getting at is there's a sense of separateness, isn't there? There's the experience of self is this experience of I'm in here, and there's a sort of kind of wall. There's a very fixed nature to that, and kind of distinct nature to that, separate nature to that. And you're out there, aren't you? And there's a kind of distinct nature to you as well. Yeah, that's definitely it. Yeah.
From my experience, I think, yes, there's definitely like a consistent body, and there are these memories that are attached to it. But I don't know, for me, I don't think I could say it was fixed, because it's this journey, and there are different versions of myself. So there hasn't really been a fixed version of who I am. You know, I learn and I grow and I change all the time, and I have memories of being these different versions of myself, but that's not necessarily who I am now.
That's right, and you certainly, that comes up with reflection, doesn't it? But it's interesting because, say, for example, and if we really went with that reflection, that would lead us to enlightenment. But our experience of self on a sort of day-to-day basis is often much more sort of defended and fixed, isn't it? It's like that. If that was our experience of ourselves, that were this sort of fluid thing, there wouldn't be much of a problem. It'd be great.
I think you can only see the fluidity in hindsight.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So you can sort of clock it with a bit of awareness and reflection, can't you? But there's this kind of raw kind of experience. It goes, and the Buddhist teaching says this goes right down to the very core of our being. That our experience of ourself as being fixed and as being separate goes right down to the very absolute core of our being. And you notice this, say, for example, if you ever feel threatened, don't you? If anybody's sort of threatening your sense of self, either sort of physically or emotionally or whatever it might be, there's this very, very strong response that comes right from our very kind of fibre of our being. Sometimes you do these sort of meditations in Buddhism that look to loosen up this sense of self, and sometimes what you get to is you get to this, you sort of sort through it, you shift through it a bit, and then you kind of get to something where it's this absolute like rock hard sense of me, like, and it goes right, it's a deeply sort of evolved phenomena, isn't it? It probably, our sense of self probably helped us evolve way back, wherever, the Serengeti or whatever it was, but it goes right back to those most evolved primordial aspects of ourselves, and it's very, very deep. Buddhism says it's one of the deepest things you could possibly get. It's not something that will just sort of easily easily go away with a bit of reflection. In Buddhism, it's said to take lifetimes to try and shake off ourselves from this sense of a sort of fixed, separate self. I was thinking, actually, it was the other day, I caught myself thinking of one of those sort of moments where you go, oh God, I have such a sort of raw, kind of uncivilized, uncouth sense of self when it ever gets sort of threatened, and I had to laugh at myself. I don't know if people do this thing, but I have this we all have our little things, don't we, that sort of drive us completely crackers. And for me it's people, when people tailgate you on the tube, when they come through, when you put the card through and they come in, like, why does that annoy me so much? Why does that annoy me so much? It doesn't bother me. It's not the principle of not paying for the tube, because I see people do it to other people and I don't waste a second thought on it. But when they do it to me, they sort of, and I've started to develop all these kind of evasive maneuvers where I think if I'm being tailgated, I'll double back quickly, like a dog fight in like Top Gun or something like that. I'll double back around really quickly and be like, ha ha, or I'll sort of give them a good stare as they come by, and I really let them know they've upset me. But they've not taken anything from me. They've not hurt me in any way. They've not stolen from me. But they've transgressed me somehow. And it's that raw kind of primordial sense of self that feels sort of hard done by, based on absolutely nothing at all. So it's so funny, isn't it? It's just sort of like it manifests itself out of absolutely nothing, the self, quite often. So that's what happens. We have this illusion that the self is persistent, that it sort of lasts through time. So we think of it sort of existing all the way from when we were children, and then right up to the point that we are now. So we still often say, for example, if you feel like somebody hurt you many years ago, for example, you still feel the pain of that, you still feel hurt by that, don't you? Even and especially when you were children, you feel that self that was hurt then sort of persists, and you're still kind of offended for it now, or angry for it now. We're kind of hurt and defended about past self, past us, and the self that's been sort of transgressed and we've carried through. And then also what we tend to do is we start to shore up and protect and kind of collect and appropriate for our future sense of self as well. So we imagine that self going right through to the point of old age and death, and that's what we do. We sort of, we save up for old age, don't we? We get kind of greedy for things that we need as we get older, all of those things. So we project ourselves into the future and into the past as this sort of fixed self, and we look to defend it, and we look to sort of push it forward. So the self is persistent, and also experience is also, as we were saying earlier, it's separate as well. So it's separate from the experiencing that we're having, the experience that we're having. It sort of sits outside of the experience that we're having and kind of owns it in some sort of way. And then it's also separate from the people in the world around us as well. So that's our sort of raw experience of self. Now, Buddhism would say that that's a complete illusion, that self that we think we have, which sits outside of our experience and owns our experience, and persists through time, both into the past and into the future, is a complete illusion. It's not actually there. We sort of we layer it, we read it into our experience, or we layer it into our experience. What the Buddha would say is, if we actually just look at our experience now, that sense of fixed, separate self, you won't actually find it. But it's sort of layered right into, we sort of layer it right onto our experience. We read it into our experience, and Buddhism would say that it's a delusion. So the first one of those is that it's persistent, so that we abide through time. But of course, as we know, we don't find anything in our sense of self abiding through time, do we? It's like if, say, for example, we look at our body, apparently all the cells in our body are renewed every 7 years. Apparently, every 7 years, we don't have a single cell that we had in our body 7 years ago. So we know that our body doesn't contain that sort of fixed self, because it's not permanent. You can see it as you get older. You can see it change very, very rapidly, can't you? And so it's terrible. It's awful. Somehow I always think I've come to the end of my aging process. You ever do? I look in the mirror. It's like, okay, a few wrinkles, but not too bad. That's it now, done with. And of course, 2 years later there'll be a few more wrinkles, and all the rest of it, and it goes on and on and on. So we know that the body doesn't abide and persist through time. So there can't be that sort of fixed entity in the body either. That it can't be found in the body. So the self can't be found in the body. And of course, our mind is completely changed as well. It was just like you were saying earlier. Often we think of ourselves like sort of how much our mind changes over time. Some things we can sort of stay fairly sort of stable in us, but oftentimes we can just completely change. You ever have that experience of sort of thinking back to a younger you? I have this and not being quite able to relate to them. Like they had some sort of, I don't know, they were just a very different person. I sort of think back on I remember once on retreat, and I was thinking back of I was thinking back like 5 or more years ago at the time, and I was just thinking about this problem that I used to create for myself all the time. I just used to find myself creating this particular problem for myself all the time. I can't even remember what it was now. And I just couldn't figure out what it was about. I was like, what was all that about? Why did I do? I couldn't even sort of reassemble it for myself. I was like, what was the issue there? What was the difficulty? I just couldn't relate to myself in that past way anymore. So we know that mind completely changes as well. So there's no persistence through the body, and there's no persistence through mind either. So we also sort of think of ourselves as kind of separate from others, and separate from others. And of course, if you look to experience, you'll know, well, let's look at the example of mind, for example. If you really look at your mind, quite often you'll see that it's an incredibly sort of permeable thing. We think of our mind as sort of distinct and separate and ours. We think of our mind. But if, for example, if you ever are in a crowd of people, you can start to see that your mind is actually conditioned very quickly by other people's minds as well. Like in here, for example, we're all giving rise to a sort of quality of mind. Now, we won't all experience it in the same sort of way, but we're all being affected by each other's minds, for example. Like I'm being affected by your minds. I quite like it when you all smile and laugh at my terrible jokes, for example. That affects my mind. And of course, my mind is then hopefully having some sort of effect on your mind. It's interesting. One of the first things that that you get told as an order member when you start teaching is you have to be very careful when you start talking about anger. If you ever give a class on anger, one of the things that happens is it evokes anger in people. And I remember having this experience once where I was like, I gave this, rather naively, I gave this class on hatred and ill will and anger. And I get 10 minutes into talking about anger and everybody is looking furious. The whole class is just looking so angry. And I had to say, well, sometimes what can happen actually when you talk about anger is it gives rise to anger. But it's an example of how actually our minds are just so much sort of conditioned by the conditions around us. And the conditions around us for minds, one of the most significant conditions are other minds. If you walk into a room of happy people, that tends to sort of give rise to a happy mind, doesn't it? If you walk into a room of depressed people, it can give rise to a depressed mind. And they don't even really have to start communicating much. Minds are so permeable that nobody even has to say anything. You just have this collective experience of joy in a group of joyful people or anger in a group of angry people. So what that suggests is that your mind and my mind is much less sort of isolated and selfie, for want of a better word, than we think. It's actually co-arises much more with other minds around us and the conditions that we put it into. Now, I think what that means actually is that one of the most interesting things for me when I reflect on this is that is the reflection that my mind is not my own. I don't know if anybody had this particular experience. I remember when I was younger, I was very depressed when I was in my sort of late teens and early 20s. And I remember just sort of feeling so kind of betrayed by my own mind. Like And I didn't want to have to go sort of get therapy or meditate or something like that, because I thought, well, somebody else doesn't have that particular problem. Why is my mind shouldn't be either? As if my mind was mine, for me just to sort of dictate what it should do. So mind isn't sort of ours in that particular way. We don't own it. It's much more true to say, actually, I think that probably that we're custodians of our minds, that we are responsible for them, but we don't own them. In Buddhism, actually, mind is just another element. It's much like air element or water element or fire element. It has an independent life of its own. And our job as custodians of minds is to try and sort of figure out what helps mind thrive. Because it's not our mind to dictate what it is that it should do. So say, for example, if we fill our mind with garbage, well, then the outcome of that for our mind will be poor, won't it? If we spend an evening watching, I don't know, really awful Netflix series or something like that, and drinking or whatever it might be, the effect of our mind is going to be, there's going to be the obvious consequence for that. Because our mind is conditioned by what we put into it and what we surround it with, because it's permeable, because it's not a self, because we don't own it. Yeah? So our mind is sort of is given rise to on the conditions around it. It arises independence on the conditions around it. Similarly, if we do good things with our mind, if we're good custodians of our mind, it will give rise to a beautiful mind. Hopefully, that's the idea. Yeah? So when we think of sort of ourselves, one of the things that the Buddha said is that, well, one quality of a self must be that you own it. It has to be yours to sort of own. But of course, in that particular way, we don't own our minds, and of course, we don't own our bodies either. That's the thing, don't we? You know, not only will our minds betray us, but our bodies will eventually betray us as well. They grow older, they get sick, and they eventually die. Our body isn't ours to sort of tell it how it's going to be. It also sort of betrays us, and our mind betrays us as well, doesn't it? So there's not a sort of self, the Buddha would say, that because there's not that sense of we can't claim that sense of ownership over any aspect of ourselves. It can't be a true self in that particular way. It can't be the thing that we read into it. It'll be very different from that. It'll be very, very different from that. Maybe I'll stop there because this is pretty dense stuff. Is there any questions on all of that? Does anyone have questions on that? Yeah.
So as you said, our minds and body are not in our control. So what control do we have?
Well, I think we don't have ultimate control. That's a good question. So we do have some control, but we don't have ultimate control. We can, for example, take care of our bodies, can't we? And Buddhism would really encourage that as well, like eating well, exercising, all of those sorts of things. We can take care of our bodies, and we can take care of our minds as well. But we don't have ultimate control, because obviously, well, we know our bodies will, irrespective of how well we treat them, they will get sick and they will grow old and die. So there's not an ultimate sense of we ultimately, and this is the trick, isn't it? It's hard to do. You have to be a custodian of your mind and your body, but also be willing to recognize that it has its own sort of dynamics as well. A bit like if you can imagine if you have children. You know, you are the custodian for your children, but your children are their own little people as well, aren't they? And parents very, very rapidly learn that children are not blank slates. They do not they won't be formed in your image. They have their own ideas about life, and their own little characteristics and their own little characters, their own little personalities. Often that comes out really, really soon in kids as well, and you can't see where it comes from. It's like, God, they don't seem to be of their parents in any way. Anyway, I'm slightly going off, but the metaphor is that you are the custodian for your children if you have children, but eventually your children will do their own thing as well.
So, thank you for the explanation, but that was super clear from the no self. I didn't get it at the start, but I really understand it now. So, is the ultimate goal for those striving to be enlightened self-realization? It's the realization of what you've just said.
Well, it's the no self-realization, you could say.
Sorry, correct.
Yeah. So it would be. Is there any more? Is there any more to question?
That was the question.
Yeah. So that is it basically. To become enlightened is to completely see through that delusion of a fixed, separate self. The experience of that, and I might say a little bit about the experience of that, because on my first retreat that I went to, it was in Cavan in Ireland many years ago, sort of 12, 13 years ago. And we were doing this walking meditation, and we were going up and down, and as it tends to do in Ireland, it started to rain. Yeah, nothing particularly new there, but it started to rain. And it was very strange because we were doing these sort of impermanence and no self-reflections through the retreat. And all of a sudden, I just had this really, and it sort of opened up. It was like a window opening up very briefly and then closing down. But this sudden sort of realization of how liberating it would be to drop my sense of self. It would be, the feeling of it was at the time was just total liberation, like just putting down a burden. You know, when you were a kid and you had that enormous rucksack on your back that you had to lug around all day, and you'd get into the house and you'd take it off your back and chuck it in the corner, and the feeling of just like, oh, that's so nice to have that off, to just take off that sort of heavy weight. It was that similar sort of experience. This thing that I was so sort of defensive of, that I was so jealous of, that I sort of put so much time into the project of, I just, for a few seconds, I couldn't tell quite long, I just dropped completely. And the feeling was just total liberation. You know? So Buddhism would say that this self that we walk around with is just incredibly burdensome. Like it's the source of all the problems, all the issues, all the war, all the greed, all the inequality, everything like that in the world basically stems from this sense of fixed and separate self that needs to sort of appropriate things to it to shore itself up and push away, appropriate what it identifies with to shore itself up, and push away what it disidentifies with, what it doesn't like. Yeah, so appropriate self and then push away other, and from that whole sort of dynamic, you get all the problems of history, all the war, all the genocide, everything like that. You get coming from that. I'll just take one question. Yeah, go on.
Firstly, thank you for your talk so far.
Yep.
I'm following the idea of you not being your mind or your body. But I guess I'm struggling with being the custodian part of it.
Oh yeah.
In my mind, it implies that there is something that has custody over the mind and the body.
Right.
There is a thing there.
Yeah.
I don't know if you could speak more to sort of what that thing is or isn't.
Well, that thing, whatever it is impermanent and connected. So there's nothing in your whole range of experience that isn't in somehow constantly in flux, and also conditioned by the world around you. So there's nothing of a self in that in the way that we'd read into it, which is sort of fixed and separate, if you get me. There is, of course, some agency. Yeah, Buddhism isn't saying there's no agency. It is saying there is agency. In fact, the first thing that Buddhism says is you need to take responsibility for yourself, which assumes agency. But that agency doesn't come from a fixed and separate entity. I think that's probably the way to put it. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Okay. Good. So, yeah. So one of the things that you can do, because I want to leave us with some sort of sense of how it is that we can start to work with this sort of fixed sense of self. And one of the things that Sangharakshita said, actually, one of the best things that we can do is particularly start to look to give up preference, give up preferences. So we all have these sort of little myriad number of preferences, don't we, that we sort of like. We like this particular cereal, we like our coffee at this time in the day, we like coffee over tea, we like this program and not this program. I have this very strongly. It's feedback that I get very consistently from my spiritual friends, from my spiritual mentors, is that my sense of preference is much too strong. If I don't get, this particular type of coffee in the morning, the whole day's ruined. It's complete bear. I like this particular exercise at this time, and like not that exercise at that time, and then I like to go here when I go away, and all the rest. I like watch this program and all the rest, and much too sort of narrow and much too sort of tightly kind of held sense of preference. Now those preferences are the things that make it, when you get hundreds of those, because we all have sort of hundreds of those, and you kind of gather them up into a ball, then you have a very fixed, heavy sort of entity, don't you? And that's what Buddhism is saying, actually, is that all of those tiny little, hundreds of little reactions, preferences, tendencies, habits, views, all of those sorts of opinions, all of those sorts of things, which in of themselves are completely fluid and interconnected. What happens is we gather them all up and they become this hard, solid self, this entity of self. And what Sangharakshita is saying, that actually what you can start to do to start to overcome this sort of fixed and separate sense of self is start to just give up those sense of preferences. So if, for example, and I find this very hard, you're going for a movie with friends, they say, I'd really like to see this, and it happens to be, I don't know, Korean avant-garde, arty, or something like that. If that's your thing, great, fantastic. It's not particularly mine, right? So I should go, great, fantastic, let's go see that, that would be what is the appropriate thing to do if you're looking to sort of disassemble this sense of self, is just actually just starting to drop those sort of myriad little preferences and habits that we have, because they start to just form a very solid, hard, concrete sense of self. Views is another one. We have such sort of fixed and hard views of the world, and of course when they're challenged we often feel very, very threatened, don't we? So can we start to let go of those views? That's not to say that we don't have any thoughts about the world. It's not to say that we become so sort of open-minded that our brains fall out. It's more that we hold those views not so sort of hard and fixed, but much more sort of tentatively and provisionally. So you hear a view that you don't particularly like, that you disagree with. You go, I wonder. You might even say, well, that's not my particular experience of it, but that's interesting. I might sort of think about it. So just dropping those areas where out of habit we just tend to kind of grab and hold, and looking to be much more sort of open to possibility and potential. That's what Sangharakshita thought was the most practical and sort of surefire way to loosening up a sense of self. I won't take any questions. So you can do that. I think the other thing you can do that as well is just start to notice where sort of self kind of rears its head. So me, for example, with the tailgating incident, I can just go, well, that's just, who is being, what am I sort of defending in that? Who am I defending in that? If somebody cuts in front of the line in front of me, I try my best to go, okay, but who has been cut in front of the line? Who's been sort of offended or transgressed in that sense? Does that have to be such a sort of fixed entity that you need to defend at all sorts of at all times? So you can think something along those lines. So sort of just looking to see where self kind of pops up, where self has been sort of threatened, or you feel like you're sort of shoring up your sense of self or defending a sense of self, and can you just sort of relax that? Can you just notice it and just sort of let it go a bit? Okay, so there's absolutely buckets in that, so I'm not gonna say any more. But what we might do is we might just do a little bit of meditation just to end, and we'll just do a metta bhavana actually. And interestingly enough, Sangharakshita did think metta bhavana was a wisdom meditation. Did feel it could lead all the way up to enlightenment. So why don't we do a little bit of meditation? So just coming back to a sense of the body. We can just look to send ourselves well-wishing. Just wishing ourselves well. And then we can extend that well-wishing to all living beings. that note. So thank you very much. So if, just to say as well, the centre here is run on the basis of people's generosity, so that the teachers and the team give their time completely for free. And those that work for the centre don't do so for a salary, they do so for just for support. And one of the reasons is that we want to just look to reach out to as many people as possible with the message of the Buddha, with the Buddha's teachings, which we believe is so deeply needed. And just give these classes for free on the basis of donations, so that anybody can come irrespective of means. So if you gave on the way in, thank you very, very much. So as Dana bowls on the way in, generosity bowls on the way in. If you've given, thank you very, very much. It's hugely appreciated. If you haven't, you still can if you'd like to. So Talina will be holding a bowl just on the way out, so you can still give as well. And anything you can give is really hugely appreciated. Yeah. But we'll leave it at that, and we'll be at the start of another series next week. I can't remember what it is, but there will be a series next week. So do come back for that as well. Okay. See you soon. Take care.